Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the final session of the day. We're going to take a look now. We're going to reflect on what we've heard during the day, and we're sort of going to look forward a little bit. This is a chance to wrap up, listen, think about some of the commonalities, some of the themes that have come out of the day, and if there are any missing elements as we look forward to 2015 and beyond. I have a couple of guests on stage with me already. We're going to hear from them, and then we'll have some time for questions, and then we'll invite a couple of other speakers up, our distinguished guests, to give us some closing remarks. So very briefly, just from what I've been listening to today, some of the themes that I'm hearing that have come out are that ODA is declining, it's not enough anyway, so financing must come from other sources. I've heard a lot of criticism about the MDGs, for having unfinished business, for not embracing sustainability or environmental issues, for being top-down and not consultative enough. So that means that there's a need for a unifying framework and the paradigm shift from aid effectiveness to effective development. And we've also heard how the post-2015 agenda needs to emphasize sustainable jobs created through the use of technology. It must enshrine accountability driven by good governance, but the question is, how do you achieve that? How do you even define accountability? And then how do you guarantee a space for civil society organizations once intergovernmental negotiations begin? So these are some of the themes that I have been picking up on. I'm sure you have other ideas. I'm sure our panelists do. So to begin with, we just heard from him, so I'm going to invite Mr. Ad Melkert, former UNDP Associate Administrator, to give us his comments, his thoughts on what he's heard during the day. You can do it from there if you prefer.
Thank you very much. I'd like to pick up, as I've been asked, on the third session in particular, but obviously we're building this afternoon on many of the elements mentioned in the presentations this morning. And I'd like to make actually three sets of remarks on that. First, what we heard in terms of suggestions on the way forward, and in fact, addressing the perceived weaknesses of the approach through the MDGs so far, is a number of methods that would improve results. Building institutions, strengthening accountability and audit mechanisms, reducing bribery and corruption, very important but difficult point. Follow the money. I thought it was actually a very good notion to introduce, because it would help both at the recipient and at the donating side to be quite specific on how money goes from A to B, and what one achieves with that. Problems rather than solutions should define capacity building, I noted. I thought that was an interesting notion as well, because in this best practices, and I must say myself, also in UNDP, we have promoted a lot of this best practice idea, and people can of course learn and should learn from each other. But it is also true that in best practices there is sometimes a kind of rigidity, that one does not sufficiently take into account specific circumstances, local differences, local preferences also, that might make it actually more interesting to help each other analyze and recognize the problems, but then be quite open to the way that solutions should be found, which might be very different in A as compared to B. So I think that is an important notion. And it was linked to saying maybe monitoring is more important than evaluation. And I must say I have witnessed often evaluation processes that were very long, very cumbersome, costly, And Richard, I hope you don't mind me saying, but sometimes the evaluators are also a class in itself, where, say, the outcome of the evaluation is not very understandable to the target audience. I hope there are not too many evaluators in this room. But those things, this is really the time, you know, at the end of the first 15 years, to mention some of the things by their name and to try to see how we can learn from experiences so far and maybe do it better. So I like the notion of putting monitoring in the center, basically being less prescriptive, but more experimental and empirical. And that could be an approach for the future, and could also help the points that I myself made on the recalibration of ODA. So certainly not saying ODA we have had, but to recalibrate it, really to modernize it, and also to be realistic about it, because continuing to repeat the same mantra, and you see that in 20, 30 years, you're not making a lot of progress actually with some things, doesn't make sense. You're loosening the edge of making the point. So that is one thing that I heard, more effective methods and adjusting on the basis of what we have learned. But those methods, and that is the other side of it, will not work if it will not be done within a more conducive environment. And the examples that were mentioned there was about the role of parliaments, and also the learning and the capacity of parliaments to really track the policies and their results, and to impose basically upon the authorities that they are holding themselves accountable in showing those results. But also the role of the media, including the role of social media. Freedom of press is a sensitive issue, we must recognize in the UN, but it is hard to argue that one could achieve a lot of progress if there's also not, say, a critical mass of opinion making within the country. Some places the social media may play that role, in other places the formal media, but it remains an element of a conducive environment. Same goes for the role of civil society. Basically the notions of pluralism and openness help to accelerate progress, because in a climate of openness, it is easier to learn from your mistakes. And many mistakes are being made and will be made, but going then, bringing it back to the right track requires an open discussion. So this effective methods and conducive environment are actually cross-cutting through all the themes, and it could be worth further exploring along those lines what we can come up with, what we can further discuss, what also could be exchanged in terms of experiences and insights. The second remark I'd like to make is actually based on Richard's slides for and against internationally agreed objectives, because after all, the Millennium Development Goals started very top-down at the time, Kofi Annan's initiative, and it really took a long time before it reached the grassroots. But it was, of course, derived from perceiving what was actually happening, what was the real situation of poverty and deprivation for many people, and something had to happen. And in that sense, the Millennium Development Goals, in my view, really has been a brilliant concept, but obviously also with weaknesses. And it's actually good to hear that, or to see that the high-level panel suggests now more to define or to have targets defined nationally, which by implication means that targets will be defined in a more differentiated way. I don't think that should be a problem as long as countries remain ready to open up their databases for delivering data and also for comparing data, because this should really remain the international side of the approach. Also, I think that the point that Richard made about, say, the weaknesses of international objectives, that they may not be locally owned or may be inappropriate, that could be met at least halfway, but maybe more than that, by further elaborating the very interesting effort by UNDP to have these million voices heard. And I really must commend Rebecca for leading that project. I find it extremely interesting that you have managed now to connect many more voices, say bottom-up, with that classic top-down approach from the UN. And I think if you could find a further stage, in fact, of setting a kind of framework, and I think the universal goals suggested by the high-level panel provide a very interesting framework, but that you would actually on a kind of semi-permanent basis ask or enable people to participate in guiding within those frameworks what the key questions are, what the practical issues are, the questions that people have, the criticisms that they have, and you continue to connect these two sides of the approach. I think that's extremely promising, and much more could be done there with the assistance of the social media. So there, probably also the tension around internationally agreed objectives and local ownership could be bridged. And I would certainly promote that conciliation between the two sides would be further developed. And the third point I'd like to make is about these universal goals themselves. And I think that in what the high-level panel proposes, there are particularly three additional targets, so to speak, compared to the 8 MDGs with which we have or have been working, are still working in this stage, that require a lot of attention, and that probably also will make the difference between the first 15 years and, let's assume, the next 15 years. I know it will still require 2 years of discussion within our wonderful UN, but I also trust that on the 31st of December 2014, 12 o'clock in the night, something like that, there will certainly be an agreement on how to move on. The 3 universal goals that I would certainly recommend are the governance goal, the catalyzing of the long-term financing goal, and the job creation goal. Now, the first 2 matters we have discussed this afternoon, so in that sense, we are, I think, looking at the right points and further elaborating on those 2 axes of the governance and the financing should certainly be part and parcel of the further preparatory process. But I'd like to say a few words more about the job creation universal goal 8 in the approach by the high-level panel. Because I believe for 2 reasons this is crucial. I know, and my friend Pinheiro will confirm that, how much ILO has tried to get this job creation goal more at the center of things, but it was difficult because there's always something of ideology, like you cannot just create goals and the market will take care of the jobs of people, and once the conditions are in place, like the bank and the IMF like to promote everything will be fine. I do hope that the enormous, deep crisis of these years, starting in the US and Europe, but of course it has really become a global crisis, and it certainly has also become a global jobs crisis, has opened the eyes of everyone that regardless where you stand politically or ideologically, jobs are not only a matter of markets, they're also a matter of policies and of government commitment and of solidarity. And this is an extremely important angle to prepare for the next round of MDGs. And there's a second reason why it's so important. Because what I think we see, certainly in China, but also in other places, and I liked very much the presentation of Ghana, for instance, this morning, is that there's so many examples of real progress in education. Also the global partnership is in that sense quite successfully active. Education and health. But now let's assume that indeed after 15 years we can say there were enormous breakthroughs in education and health. So what's next? We will have a more healthy and a better educated population, a very young population in many countries that cannot find jobs. This is the reality in many countries. I'm working myself in the Gulf area where this is an issue in relatively small countries. It is of course a huge issue in the bigger countries, in the emerging economies and elsewhere. And it is also a condition for generating the resources that you need to really bring national governments, states to the next level of being able to provide social security benefits, universal healthcare arrangements, going back to the point I made before the break, that social entitlements are extremely important for progress, but you can only provide them if everybody contributes to their financing. And you cannot do that by foreign direct investments, you cannot do that by capital markets, you cannot do it by ODA. It has to be generated in the economy, in a productive economy itself. And you can make an economy more productive because your people have been better educated and they're more healthy. So this is something that comes together in a very interesting way, but now needs to be taken up, and it will be a huge political challenge to have the recognition that job creation is something that governments should subscribe to and should put in place proactive labor market policies. We're not yet there, I tell you from my own experiences, but this is what I think should be very important in the way forward. And I'm very happy to see that the high-level panel has in any case made this proposal, and my recommendation to UNDP and others would be to really embark on that and to prepare further the ground for a political commitment on that as a basis for the next 15 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Melkert. We've been joined on the panel by Rebecca Greenspan and at the end there, Ms. Oh Young-ju from the Ministry for Foreign Affairs here in the Republic of Korea. We'll be hearing from them later on. My next speaker, though, is Kate Higgins. There she is. She is a senior researcher at the North-South Institute, which is a Canadian international development think tank, and there she leads on the Governance for Equitable Growth program, and she's going to discuss a little bit about how today's conference fits into a wider development conversation, please.
Thanks so much, and it's great to be joining the panel this afternoon. I was actually tasked with trying to provide a bit of a summary of today's proceedings and some of the key messages and takeaways that we might want to take away from this conference. Many thanks to the Korean government and to UNDP for the invitation to participate in this conference today. I hope that in the 10 minutes I have, I'm able to identify some key messages from today's proceedings, but also do justice to the nuances and the detail that we've learned about and heard about today. So let's see how I go. I think to start, it's useful for us just to return to this morning, which I know seems like quite a long time ago, but where we were offered a very useful overview of the context that we're operating within. And I just want to identify a few of the issues or areas where it seems that there is some global consensus, and that coming out of the UN General Assembly 2 weeks ago, we seem to have some understanding or at least some consensus about how we're going to go forward. So the first is that the post-2015 agenda should be people-centred but planet-sensitive. I think that's really a very crucial point for us to take away, because that is really going to frame how these discussions move forward. The second relates to this, which is that the post-2015 agenda should have poverty eradication at its heart, but do this in the context of sustainable development. Now, this is easy to say and much more difficult to do, and that's what this conference really has started a conversation around. The third point is that when we talk about sustainable development in the context of the post-2015 development agenda, we are not just talking about environmental sustainability. We are talking about the 3 pillars of sustainable development: the economic, the social, and the environmental pillars, and how these are crucial to a people-centred and planet-sensitive agenda. I think we also have consensus from a procedural perspective on the view that there needs to be 1, not 2, post-2015 development agendas, and that we will need to decide and negotiate how the Sustainable Development Goals agenda that came out of Rio+20 and the post-2015 development agenda comes together for one set of post-2015 goals. And finally, we have consensus that this really needs to be a universal agenda that is country relevant. So this is the context that we're operating within. Now, within that, through some really excellent work of the United Nations, and they really must be congratulated, 1.4 million people, 1.4 million voices in 190 countries, I think you said this morning, have been consulted on what the issues within this Sustainable Development Agenda should be. Now, we know that some of the MDG issues, like health and education, for example, still remain absolute priorities. But within that, the approach that we take, or the priorities that we might have within those specific themes, may be different, and issues around quality are vitally important. But there are some new issues that are getting traction and that are clearly important. We heard that governance is really coming through as a strong and important issue. We've just heard about the importance of employment and the quality of growth. Peace and security was not integrated into the MDGs, but is incredibly important for fragile and conflict-affected states. Obviously, the environment needs to attract more attention. And the idea that we need to really think about progress in a disaggregated or distributional way, where we are not leaving anyone behind. So this is the context that we're operating within. Now, what's fantastic about today's conference is the Korean government and UNDP have enabled us to really start a conversation about the how, not necessarily the what. There's been a range of processes identifying the what, and now we're transitioning into the how. How are we actually going to implement a post-2015 development agenda, and what lessons can we learn from the MDGs to really make this as effective as possible? In summarising the how, I have identified 5 themes that I'll speak through quite quickly. And in all of these, I have a takeaway message, or 2 takeaway messages, but also a bit of a question or a challenge that I have been left thinking about. Now, that might not be completely satisfactory, but I think that given this is really the start of the conversation on implementation, I think it's very useful for us to identify some specific issues or areas where we think there may be some challenges, whether they're technical or political. So my first theme is institutions. It's key that institutions are absolutely key for the post-2015 development agenda and for its implementation. But my takeaway message from this is that we need to think about how we connect the global framework with country-level institutions. Now, criticism of the MDGs is perhaps that we didn't do that as effectively as we could. We learned about the MDG acceleration framework today and how that was trying to connect the global agenda with country-level priorities. But it's clear that there is an agreement or a hope that the post-2015 agenda can be much more effective at connecting global priorities with country-level planning, strategies, and domestic politics. My second theme is around modalities and strategies for driving development progress. Now, we learnt so much today, whether it was from Ghana or Indonesia or Mozambique, about various strategies and modalities for driving development progress. One takeaway for me from these discussions is really about the importance of interlinkages in driving development progress in these areas. I think this is a little bit of a challenge with the MDGs and the post-2015 framework. On the one hand, we're really focused and quite committed to the goals approach because of its simplicity and because of its usefulness from an advocacy perspective. But actually, the country level or subnational reality of policy making requires much more intersection between these different goals. So, for example, we heard from Ghana around health access, how important infrastructure as a sector is. So I think thinking through these things and learning what we can from these experiences is really important for us. And I guess the question for me around this theme is, how do we really make sure that we're capturing this huge amount of evidence and learning as we take the post-2015 development agenda forward? My third theme is partnerships. We've heard a lot about partnerships today. In a lot of the analysis and discussion and consultation, there is a huge emphasis on how the MDGs were rather state-centric and that the post-2015 development agenda needs to do a much better job of intersecting and collaborating these different partners. We heard from Indonesia how they are approaching it. But it's clear that in the post-2015 agenda, we need to think about how we develop partnerships that go beyond the state and that integrate the private sector, that integrate civil society, but also go beyond the national level to ensure that cities, municipalities, local governments, subnational governments are integrated in the post-2015 agenda. I actually think that this is going to be much more difficult than it sounds. I think that these partnerships, identifying these partnerships, working out the accountability mechanisms for making them happen is actually going to be very complex. And learning from experience around this is going to be key. One thing I don't think I've heard enough about today, if I'm absolutely frank, is the Global Partnership for Development, or MDG 8. We did hear a bit about that this morning from Dr. Bhattacharya, but I think that there is consensus that MDG 8 perhaps wasn't as effective as it should have been. I think there's consensus that in the post-2015 agenda, MDG 8 really needs to, the issues encapsulated in MDG 8 need a lot more attention, but how we're going to do that, the implementation of that, I think is going to be quite tricky. So a takeaway for me is that from an implementation perspective, thinking about these issues around aid, trade, illicit flows, taxation, tax evasion, really needs some more thinking. My fourth takeaway is around financing. We've heard quite a lot about this. We've heard about the need to go beyond aid. We've heard about the importance of domestic resource mobilization for the post-2015 development agenda. We've heard from Mr. Melkert that he thinks it's a relatively bleak picture that we're facing, and that we need to balance old instruments and their effectiveness or enhancing their effectiveness with new or innovative modes of financing. And I think thinking through that balance is an important takeaway from an implementation perspective for us. Another takeaway for me around financing is how, in a universal agenda, we are going to harness and tap into this range of new financing mechanisms, how we're going to tap into and harness these older forms of financing mechanisms, while also ensuring that the special needs of least developed countries are taken into account. So how do we balance this universal agenda from a financing perspective with an agenda where we know that there are countries that are going to continue to have special needs? And my fifth and final theme is around monitoring and accountability. We've heard quite a lot about monitoring and accountability, and I was really thrilled to hear the focus that some of the panelists put on the political dimension of monitoring and accountability. We certainly heard that from Professor Gershom and others, and I think reminding ourselves that monitoring and accountability is not necessarily just technical, it is also political, is absolutely important. So I think my challenge for this fifth theme really is how are we going to engage in this agenda to ensure that the political will or political motivation is there for countries at the domestic level, so delivering sustainable development domestically, but also for countries delivering their commitments globally. And I think that is going to be a challenge, but I think thinking about the political dimension as we think about the how or the implementation challenges is really going to be critical. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take 5 minutes of questions now, throw it open to the floor, so any of you who have something that you'd like to ask, not just the members of the panel who are on the stage, but any of our speakers who we've heard from today, most of whom are still here. If you've got something you'd like to ask, then please raise your hand. Our colleagues with the microphones will come around and we'll get you to ask your question. So anybody like to start us off with a question? While you're all summoning up the courage, then I'll kick us off. And I'm going to open this up to any members of our current panel. We've talked a lot about the importance of accountability, about good governance, and the role that civil society plays in that. So my question is, how do you ensure that when it comes to intergovernmental negotiations, there is a guaranteed voice for civil society? We talked about, how you need to reconcile the top-down recommendations of the high-level panel with the bottom-up consultancy that's been going on. How do you actually marry those two, realistically? Everyone's talked about the importance of doing it. How do you actually do it? Who'd like to have a go at that? Rebecca Greenspan, would you like to tackle that question?
Well, I think that in the negotiations of Rio +20, we already learned a lot of how to maintain civil society engaged. I really believe that in the Rio +20, the space that civil society had was much wider. In the UN process, in the intergovernmental process, was much wider than before. Still not up to the expectations of many of the civil society organizations, but much better than in the past, where intergovernmental processes were really close to the participation, even a seat as equals of civil society in the intergovernmental negotiations. So there is room for improvement, but there is already a space that was not there before. So the UN can play a very important role. But let me also make a call that won't happen unless everybody remains engaged. This will be a long process. There are more than 2 years to go to have really a final decision for the post-2015 agenda. So an important call to all of you here, because here we have researchers, we have think tanks, we have active participants of the civil society. My call to you is not to disengage. If we continue to make the bottom-up, if we continue to maintain the consultation and the broad consultation in the UN, if you continue to be active in engaging yourself with ideas, with proposals, with reports, as we have seen here, there is a much better chance that we will continue to influence the agenda. Influencing the agenda is also a political process. Yeah, we are part of a political process. Also, civil society is part of a political process. And in political processes, there are no empty spaces. If we don't occupy that space, somebody else will, or the state-centric negotiations will take over. So my really very strong pledge to all of you is to remain engaged and to maintain civil society around the world and citizens around the world engaged in the discussion of this agenda.
Okay, thank you. Has anybody else got any more questions? Yes, Mr. Pinheiro, you're getting your own back from having to answer all the questions earlier on today.
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to thank Mr. Mecker for his comments on the jobs challenge, because this is a huge concern.
I need you just to ask a question, please, specifically.
Yes, it's a question. We have the challenge of generating 600 million jobs in the next 15 years, and there is no way to talk about sustainability without job creation. Just for youth, it's 408 million jobs. Of course, there's also increased labor force, female labor force participation and working poverty. And we know that active labor market policies and skills, it's important, but it's not enough.
Not hearing a question.
Because we need to generate, actually, economic growth has generated jobs. What we experience now is jobless growth. So how can we increase the job content of economic growth? I think this is the question that...
Who would you like to...
Mr. Mecker.
Look, I think it starts with the recognition that it should be part of the agenda. And as we know, that was very difficult in 2000, and now it looks with the high-level panel that there is an awareness, and I think the crisis has really helped in that it is absolutely vital to have these productive, inclusive economies work in the end for all the MDGs. Work is really the centerpiece of that. Now, the next stage is, I think, in particular, the partnership between the UN and the Bretton Woods institutions and the OECD. I think it's fair to say that, again, under influence of the crisis, there is some more thinking going on. For instance, I thought it was interesting that last year, the World Bank issued a World Development Report on job creation. I tell you, when I was in the board of the World Bank about 8 years ago, it was impossible. It was absolutely impossible to have even the word jobs mentioned in reports. Now the next stage is how to link that with macroeconomic policies. Because one thing is to have fragmented, anecdotal evidence of how you can create jobs here or there, but at the end, the bulk of the jobs has to be created by the right macroeconomic conditions in combination with proactive labor market policies, and the latter are often not considered compatible with these market economic approaches. So I believe that here, this is a typical example also where we are talking about the universal goal, because as you know, in Europe, there are 20 million, mostly young people, unemployed. And something has to be done to bring them back on track. You can simply not accept that in Spain, half of the young people are unemployed. And there are methods, as you know, I don't need to explain ILO, I hope, to create opportunities for better education, for training on the job, for experimental contracts, for reducing the costs of labor, for creating public service jobs, for introducing qualification and permanent training throughout life and career, for rebalancing actually the insertion into work from young to old. You can have all kinds of variations. There's not one recipe. it's always a combination of maybe 10 to 20 measures to make a successful policy. But there are really sufficient examples that you can achieve success, provided that there's the political willingness. So this is about the political recognition in the first place, and that's why it's so vital that now in the MDGs 2.0, it will be fully recognized.
Rebecca Greenspan, you wanted to come in here, just 60 seconds.
Very quickly, because I completely agree with everything that Admeker said. I think that is very important. I just want to add that we need to talk about jobs and livelihoods, because not all the incomes of people will come from jobs. Many of them will come from livelihoods that come from ecosystems that are under threat. And I think that that was mentioned in the morning, and it's very important that we talk about both, you know, in terms of being able to have a standard of living, earn your living, not only through jobs, but also through livelihoods, because a lot of the rural, 1.2 billion people in the world depends on their income and on the livelihoods coming from the ecosystems. And I just wanted to make that point.
Okay, thank you. And in fact, Ms. Greenspan, I'm going to ask you to speak more, to give us 3 or 4 minutes of closing remarks, if you wouldn't mind.
It's always dangerous to give a Latin American 3 or 4 minutes, but that's okay.
Okay, I'm going to reduce that to 2 minutes, please.
Let me first start by thanking all of you for being here, for the contributions today. We will really look forward to input on the negotiations and on the discussions in New York, on the very interesting exchanges that we have had here. Let me make some quick remarks. One, you put it in your remarks before this panel that there were a lot of criticism about the MDGs. I will put it differently, because I really believe that the MDGs have been very successful. Now, it's very easy to be the coach of the team after the party, yes? Now we can see what are the gaps in the MDGs, because we have learned from experience, there are lessons learned from these 15 years that have gone by. So I would say that the MDGs have weaknesses and gaps that we clearly see now, but that doesn't mean that the MDGs was not a very useful and powerful tool to gather action around very important needs for millions of people in the world, and has helped them to get a better life. So I will put it in a very positive light, despite the weaknesses and gaps that remain in the framework. The second thing is the importance of this gathering in terms of the how and not only the what. We have concentrated in the what until now, but the how will be as important. And the how is also the how about process. And I think that a lot has been said here today in terms of putting emphasis and attention to the process and not only to the outcomes. And I completely agree with that. Third point about financing, we talked about going beyond ODA, but ODA will remain important. And it will remain important also in terms of the trust of the international community in the process, not only in terms of financial flows. It's also a matter of trust, a matter of maintaining the compact in the international community. Now, domestic resources will be key, private sector resources will be key, other sources of financing, innovative ways of financing will be key, but ODA will continue to be important. And so let's not lose the ODA perspective that will be very important for least developed countries, for fragile countries, etc. Third point, emphasize the policy coherence. It's not all about money. It's also about policies at the global level. And I think that Ad said that very eloquently. It's about trade policy. It's about immigration policies. It's about the policy coherence at the global level that affect enormously what happens at the national level. Market volatilities and economic downturns can wipe away the efforts of one country despite, all the resources that have been put into it before. Third, there was this question about partnerships, and let me mention South-South and triangular cooperation. I think that it came from the China delegate. The geometry and the geography of cooperation has changed. Now we don't have only bilateral cooperation, we talk about trilateral, triangular, quadrangular cooperation. That's why I'm saying the geometry has changed. And second, not only the geometry, but the geography. Now it's not only about north-south, it's about south-south, it's about east-east. So there are many other forms of cooperation that were not really at the center stage in 2000 when the MDGs were created with the Millennium Declaration. And that will come into play in the how, very importantly, in the new agenda. Fourth, all what has been said about local partnership is very important. We need to bring together different communities. And I think that there was Richard that mentioned we need to bring the communities, the economic and social communities together with the environmental communities. That was part of the problem in Rio Plus 20. Rio Plus 20 at the beginning was completely driven by the environmental community. And the social and economic communities were behind and didn't come to the plate until late. We need to bridge that gap. We need to bring the finance ministers, and we need to bring the social ministers and the environmental minister together. That is part of the interlinkages that we have to find. Ghana and the example of Mozambique were very important in trying to make that point, but it's about actors. We need to bring the actors into the negotiations early on, not at the end, but very early on. And I think that we are in the right track, but it's important to do. And third, the information revolution, the data revolution, the transparency, monitoring, and accountability will be pretty much part of this agenda. And without it, we will be lacking one of the main instruments for the civil society and the citizens of the world to remain engaged. And this will be very important to maintain into the negotiations. So my last plea to all of you, as I said before, is that this conversation is only starting. We need to remain engaged. We need to repeat this conversation in many other fora. We need to maintain this impetus for 2 years. This is not something easy to do, but if we do, I think that we will be able really to make what we haven't been able to do until now. That is to integrate the economic, social, and environmental pillars of sustainable development. We have said that since Rio, 20 years ago. We haven't been able to do it effectively. This is a huge opportunity for the world in a moment that is really a turning point, because this may be our last chance to have it right in terms of a framework that will allow sufficient national space to adapt, but enough dynamism at the global level to drive really an agenda that will bring sustainable human development for all in the future. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Ms. Greenspan. Finally, as we know, our joint hosts today are the Ministry for Foreign Affairs here in the Republic of Korea. And from there, I would like to introduce and welcome, to make some closing remarks, Ms. Oh Young-ju. She's the Director General for Development Cooperation. Ms. Oh, thank you for waiting patiently, and I hand the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a really great honor and to participate in this very provocative conference. I was really inspired by the deliberations and discussions. And I would first like to express my sincere appreciation to all the participants for the valuable contributions to this conference. My special thanks also goes to Mr. Market and Mr. Higgins for such a succinct summary and insightful recommendations, which I believe help us to move forward with this very important agenda. I will be very brief. So actually, with only 800 days until the MDG target year, the global community is right now watching the emerging convergence of the view that the post-2015 development agenda needs to complete unfinished tasks as well as respond to new challenges, building on the achievement as well as failures of the current MDG. Also, some initial deliberations on the future development agenda at the various fora, including this, actually pointed to need for establishing a new and renewed, partnership to fully realize the vision as well as goals to be set out under the framework of the post-2015 development agenda. In this vein, the strengthening MDG 8, the current implementing mechanism within the post-2015 framework, is exceptionally vital. Against this backdrop, today's conference has provided us with the excellent food for thought when it comes to the new framework for the global development cooperation and the vision we are to pursue. Let me briefly reiterate several of the critical points on which Korean government put special emphasis on advancing this agenda. First, we understand that sustainable development should be at the very heart of the new vision for the future development agenda, and it should encompass economic growth, social justice, as well as environmental stewardship. Such a vision offers template for mutually reinforcing approaches to global challenges. Second, today, many panelists noted the essential role of global partnership in implementing the post-2015 agenda. When considering changes in the development cooperation landscape, the partnership modality that provide equal opportunities to multi-stakeholders is essential task in crafting post-2015 framework. The formation of inclusive, transparent, and accountable partnership is the primary component of the Busan Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation. Thus, the shared principle of the Busan Partnership can serve as the foundation for establishing new global partnership under post-2015 framework. Finally, in order to facilitate the implementation of the post-2015 agenda, the issue of the monitoring are very crucial. Strong accountability mechanisms need to be put in place at the global, regional, as well as local levels, engaging all relevant development actors. In this regard, we, Korean government, welcome the recommendations of the UN Secretary General, which suggested the new high-level political forum as a leading monitoring mechanism at the global level. Moreover, a new data revolution will be essential in order to strengthen the overall monitoring mechanism in the post-2015 era. Distinguished guests, we are fast approaching the watershed moment in our quest to establish a new development agenda beyond 2015. Today, we have very useful discussions not only on implementation, but indeed of all aspects of the post-2015 development agenda. It is my sincere hope that this UNDP Global Thematic Dialogue will pave the way to deepen awareness and understanding amongst the public and generate momentum in drawing consensus on the future of the post-2015 implementation mechanism. It's also very meaningful for the Korean government to be involved in this very important process. The Korean government is willing to continue to contribute to this significant global agenda setting process. Let me conclude by expressing my sincere appreciation to the UNDP as well as UNDP Seoul Policy Center for their tireless effort as well as hard work to make this conference a success. Thank you.
Ms. Oh Young-ju, 감사합니다. for your comments. Thank you to all our speakers today and for all you for coming, all you delegates, and for asking questions and listening so intently. As we said earlier, all presentation files, all the materials that our speakers have used will be available on the website. The address is undp.org/USPC. Thank you to the event management company Intercom. My name is Rajesh Merchandani from BBC News. And thank you very much for listening, and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.